May 1945. The world was a symphony of ash and silence, the final, shuddering chord of a terrible opera having just faded. For the women of the Wehrmachthelferinnenkorps, the German auxiliary corps, the end came not with a bang, but with the grinding squeal of truck brakes on a muddy road in Bavaria. Close-up on a young woman's face, smudged with dirt, her eyes a mixture of defiance and exhaustion. The gray wool of her uniform is damp, clinging to her like a second, colder skin. They were the cogs in the great machine, the voices on the radio, the hands that plotted coordinates and packed munitions. They had been told they were the bedrock of the Reich, the stoic female counterparts to the heroic men at the front. They believed it. They had to. The alternative was an abyss too terrifying to contemplate. Now, surrounded by the casual, almost bored efficiency of the American GIs, that abyss was yawning at their feet. The air, thick with the smell of pine and damp earth, was also heavy with the unfamiliar scent of the victor's tobacco, sweet and foreign. They stood in a ragged line, a collection of tired bodies bound by a shared, unspoken creed. They were soldiers of a superior ideology, temporarily inconvenienced by a materialistic, soulless enemy. They expected brutality, a vicious retribution for their years of fanatical devotion. They had been shown films of what the Bolsheviks did to their women on the Eastern Front, and propaganda had painted the Americans as little better, crude, undisciplined barbarians hiding behind a wall of machines, their minds rotted by jazz and degeneracy. So they steeled themselves, their faces hardening into masks of contemptuous resignation. They were prepared for the worst, for the predictable cruelty of a lesser people. Pride, after all, was the last fortress of the defeated. The first crack in that fortress was not a violent blow, but a gesture so small, so mundane, it was almost insulting. During the long, jostling truck ride to the processing center, one of the younger women, barely 18 and shivering more from shock than cold, began to weep silently. The tears carved clean paths through the grime on her cheeks. An American guard, a boy with freckles and hair the color of straw, noticed. He did not mock her. He did not yell. He fumbled inside his jacket and produced a bar of chocolate, something they hadn't seen in its pure, unadulterated form for years. He broke off a piece and held it out. The camera focuses on the exchange, his large, slightly clumsy hand offering the dark square, her hesitant, suspicious glance, first at the chocolate, then at his face. The other women watched, their eyes narrowed. It was a test, a trick. Perhaps it was poisoned. Perhaps it was a prelude to a more sophisticated form of cruelty, a psychological game to break their spirit. The girl, whose name was Greta, eventually took it, her fingers trembling. She did not eat it. She held it in her palm, the unfamiliar weight a strange anchor in a sea of uncertainty. The guard just grunted, turning his attention back to the passing, ruined landscape. The gesture was not repeated. It was a singular, baffling event, a stone dropped into the still, dark waters of their certainty. They explained it away, of course. The soldier was an anomaly, a weak link. Perhaps he was of German descent and felt a flicker of misguided pity. It meant nothing. It was a statistical error in the grand equation of their enemy's barbarism. They held on to that explanation, clutching it like a talisman against the creeping tendrils of doubt. But the anomalies began to accumulate, forming a pattern that their rigid ideology could not easily dismiss. At the makeshift prisoner of war camp, a repurposed farmstead surrounded by fresh-smelling barbed wire, they were processed. They expected to be stripped and jeered at, their bodies made into a spectacle of humiliation. Instead, the process was handled with a dispassionate, almost clinical efficiency. Female U.S. Army nurses, women with stern but not unkind faces, directed them through showers and delossing stations. A shot of steam-filled rooms, the hiss of water, the sharp, clean smell of disinfectant soap. The soap was real soap, not the gritty ersot substance made of clay and sand they had used for the last 2 years. The towels were rough but clean. They were given new, plain clothing, simple shifts and trousers of coarse American cotton. It was dehumanizing, yet it was not cruel. There was no leering, no taunting, only a detached sense of procedure. Their own SS guards, in similar situations, would have used the moment to inflict 1,000 small wounds on the spirit. These Americans, however, seemed to be merely doing a job. The contrast was a low, unsettling hum beneath the surface of their thoughts. Their indoctrination had told them that this was merely a facade, a carefully constructed illusion for the benefit of the Red Cross or some other neutral observer. But how far could an illusion go? If you're finding this exploration of clashing ideologies as fascinating as we do, consider subscribing and hitting the notification bell. You won't want to miss how this story unfolds. The first meal was another assault on their expectations. They were herded into a large barn, the air thick with the smell of hay and boiled coffee. They were handed metal trays. On the trays were portions of food that seemed impossibly luxurious. A thick slice of white bread, not the dense, dark rye filled with sawdust they were accustomed to. A scoop of what looked like actual corned beef hash, and a steaming mug of coffee that smelled rich and real. The women stared at the food, their hunger warring with their suspicion. In the Third Reich, food had been a weapon, a tool of control. Good food was for the party elite, for the soldiers at the front, for the chosen. The dregs were for the rest. To be given such a meal as a prisoner was a violation of the natural order of things. Ilse, a stern, sharp-featured woman who had been a communications supervisor, was the first to speak, her voice a low hiss. "It is to fatten us," she whispered to the woman next to her, "like geese. They will work us to death, and they want us strong enough to endure it." This became the new consensus. The kindness was pragmatic, a logical investment. They were not being treated as humans. They were being maintained as assets, like cattle or machinery. This explanation was comforting. It allowed them to maintain their sense of moral superiority. Their captors were not humane. They were simply efficient capitalists, applying the principles of the factory floor to the management of prisoners. They ate, at first hesitantly, then with a ravenous, almost desperate hunger that shamed them. The taste of real food was a ghost on their tongues, a memory of a childhood before the war, before the endless rationing and ersatz substitutes. Close up on a woman closing her eyes as she chews the soft white bread, a single tear tracing a path down her cheek. The act of eating became a silent, internal battle. With every bite, they were consuming the evidence of the enemy's abundance, its seemingly infinite resources. Their own nation, which they had been told was the most powerful and advanced in the world, had been starving its people for years to feed the war machine. Yet here, in this remote corner of a conquered land, their captors could afford to feed their prisoners white bread and coffee without a second thought. The implications were staggering, a weight that settled in the pits of their stomachs alongside the food. They finished their meals in a tense, brooding silence, the clatter of forks on metal trays the only sound. They were still prisoners, still defeated, but the nature of their defeat was beginning to transform. It was not just a military loss, it was a logistical one, a failure of resources so total and complete that it bordered on the incomprehensible. They had been told they were fighting a decadent, crumbling society. The evidence on their dinner trays suggested otherwise. The days settled into a routine, and it was this routine that began to truly unravel them. There was no random cruelty. The guards, a mix of young draftees and older reservists, were not the snarling monsters of Goebbels' newsreels. They were bored, homesick, and largely indifferent. They enforced the rules, but without the ideological fervor the women were used to. An infraction earned you a reprimand or a loss of privileges, not a beating. A request, if reasonable, was often considered. One of the older women, a former nurse named Anka, fell ill with a fever. She expected to be left in her bunk to recover or die. Instead, she was taken to the camp infirmary, where an American doctor examined her with gentle, professional hands. He spoke to her in broken German, his voice calm and reassuring. He diagnosed her with pneumonia and treated her with a new drug they called penicillin. A shot of the needle going into her arm, the clear liquid of the antibiotic, a symbol of a medical technology far beyond their own. Anka recovered within a week, weak but alive. She returned to the barracks, a haunted look in her eyes. She had been saved by the enemy, treated with a care and an efficacy that she, a nurse in the German army, had rarely been able to provide for her own soldiers in the final, desperate months of the war. Her story spread through the barracks in hushed whispers. It was another anomaly, another piece of a puzzle they could not solve. They had been trained to see the world in black and white, in the stark, simple terms of friend and foe, superior and inferior. But here, in the gray twilight of their captivity, the colors were beginning to bleed together. Their enemy was supposed to be a caricature, a soulless automaton. But the truth was proving to be something far more complex and dangerous. What happens when the bedrock of your beliefs begins to crumble? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to like this video to help us explore more historical turning points. The systematic nature of the humanity was the most unnerving part. It wasn't just one kind guard or one professional doctor. It was the entire system. The mail. Through the Red Cross, they were allowed to send and receive letters. The first, censored, carefully worded letters from their families began to arrive, describing a Germany in ruins, a nation of ghosts picking through rubble. But the letters arrived. The system worked. There were books. A small library was established in one of the sheds, filled with books in German that had been confiscated from somewhere. They were mostly harmless novels and poetry, but the very existence of the library was a statement. It implied that their captors saw them not just as prisoners to be guarded, but as minds that could be occupied. This was a level of psychological consideration that was utterly alien to their own ideology, which saw prisoners as subhuman, worthy only of labor or extermination. The women would sit in the afternoons, reading the worn-out books, the words a temporary escape. But even in escape, they were confronted by the paradox of their situation. They were being treated with a degree of civilization that their own 1,000-year Reich had systematically erased from the continent. The cognitive dissonance became a constant, throbbing ache, a headache of the soul. They saw the American soldiers playing baseball in a nearby field during their off hours. Long shot of a dusty field, the lazy arc of a ball against the blue sky, the sound of laughter and shouting. The sight was obscene. How could they play? How could they laugh and treat this as just another posting, a temporary job far from home? Their own men, their brothers and fathers and husbands, had been taught that war was a total, sacred struggle, a glorious apocalypse that consumed every fiber of one's being. To see it treated with such casualness was a profound insult. It suggested that this war, which had been the defining event of their lives, the very center of their universe, was, to the Americans, a distant, manageable problem. It was a war they had come to finish, not a holy crusade they were born to fight. This realization was more humiliating than any physical abuse. It recontextualized their sacrifice. They had given everything for a cause that their enemy treated as a mere inconvenience. The easygoing nature of the Guards, which they had first interpreted as weakness, now looked like something else entirely, a symptom of unimaginable power. It was the power of a nation so strong it didn't need to hate its enemies. It could afford to be humane, because the outcome was never in doubt. They began to compare. The memories of their own service, once a source of pride, now became a source of shame and confusion. They remembered the bitter cold of the Eastern Front, the frostbite that claimed fingers and toes, the thin, watery soup that was their only comfort. They remembered the rigid, fear-based hierarchy where a minor mistake could lead to a severe punishment, where officers treated their subordinates with contempt. They remembered the constant, grinding scarcity of food, of medicine, of ammunition, of hope. They had been told this scarcity was a noble sacrifice, a sharpening of the national will. Now they saw it for what it was, a catastrophic failure of a system that had promised them the world and given them only ashes. The clean barracks, the regular meals, the absence of casual brutality in the American camp, it was all a silent, damning indictment of the Reich they had served. They had been members of the master race, yet they had lived like beggars. Their captors, the mongrelized, decadent capitalists, lived like kings even here, on a battlefield far from their own shores. The envy was a poison, a bitter bile that rose in their throats. It was mixed with a grudging, unwilling respect that they despised themselves for feeling. The world they knew was built on a foundation of lies, and now, thousands of miles from home, the tremors were beginning to bring the whole structure down. These stories of profound psychological shifts are a crucial part of understanding history. If you agree, please give this video a thumbs up. It helps our channel reach more people who are curious about the past. Then came the second shock, the one that shattered not just their ideology, but their very identity. It was a cool evening in late summer. They were herded into the main barn, where a screen had been set up. They were told it was for their re-education. They sat on the rough wooden benches, their faces set in sullen, defiant lines. They expected more propaganda, films showing the glories of American democracy, the happy, well-fed families in their impossibly clean suburban homes. They were prepared to scoff, to mentally resist the clumsy attempts at brainwashing. The projector whirred to life, and the first images flickered on the screen. It was not what they expected. The film was grainy, black and white, and silent, save for the grim, somber narration of an American officer. The images were of a place called Buchenwald, then another called Bergen-Belsen, then Dachau, a name some of them had heard whispered, a place for political prisoners, for communists and criminals. The camera moved slowly, unblinkingly through the gates of the liberated camps. It showed the piles of skeletal bodies stacked like cordwood. It showed the emaciated survivors, their eyes huge and hollow in their skull-like faces, staring blankly at their liberators. It showed the ovens, the gas chambers, the warehouses filled with human hair, with thousands of pairs of shoes, with the pathetic, tiny clothes of children. A wave of revulsion and disbelief swept through the barn. "Propaganda!" a woman shouted from the back. "Lies!" "These are actors. They are trying to trick us." The sentiment was echoed in angry murmurs throughout the group. It had to be a lie. It was a monstrous fabrication, a slander of the German people and the soldiers of the Reich. Their army was honorable. It fought hard, but it did not commit such atrocities. This was the work of the SS, perhaps, a few fanatics, but not the German nation itself. They clung to this denial, their minds recoiling from the horror on the screen. But the camera was relentless. It zoomed in on the details, the tattoos on the arms of the dead, the striped uniforms they had seen on prisoners working near their own posts, and then, the most damning evidence of all, the faces of the captors, the German guards who were being forced to bury the dead. They were familiar faces. They were not monsters from a fairy tale. They were men who looked like their neighbors, their postmen, their brothers. The narrator read from captured documents, detailing the quotas, the logistics of extermination, the cold, bureaucratic language of mass murder. The German efficiency they had been so proud of, here it was, applied to the creation of hell on earth. The silence in the barn became absolute, a heavy, suffocating blanket. The only sound was the whir of the projector and the dispassionate voice of the narrator. The women sat frozen, their faces pale in the flickering light. The images on the screen were not just an accusation, they were a mirror that reflected a truth so vile, so gargantuan in its evil, that it annihilated everything they had ever believed. Their sacrifices, their hardships, their faith in the Führer and the fatherland, it had all been in service of this industrial-scale slaughter. This moral abyss. Greta, the young girl who had been given the chocolate on the first day, began to vomit, the retching sobs echoing in the cavernous silence. No one moved to comfort her. They were each trapped in their own private hell. The foundations of their world turned to dust. The film ended. The lights came on, harsh and unforgiving. They saw the faces of their American guards, standing by the doors. There was no triumph in their eyes, no "I told you so." There was only a quiet, weary pity. And that was the cruelest cut of all. It was the pity of the sane for the insane, of the saved for the damned. They walked back to their barracks under a starless sky, not as defeated soldiers, but as the unwilling accomplices to a crime against humanity. The weight of history is often the weight of an unbearable truth. If you believe these stories need to be told, share this video with someone who needs to see it. The days that followed the film screening were a blur of numb disbelief and agonizing introspection. The easy camaraderie of the barracks, born of shared experience and a common enemy, evaporated. It was replaced by a tense, suspicious silence, punctuated by sudden, vicious arguments. Some, like Ilsa, the former communications supervisor, clung desperately to denial. "It is a Hollywood production," she would insist, her voice brittle. "They have used their Jewish film tricks to defame us. The bodies are from their own bombing of Dresden." But her words lacked conviction. The images had been too real, too specific. Others retreated into a catatonic state, their eyes vacant, performing their daily tasks like automatons. They were wrestling with a question of terrifying proportions. If the cause they had served was fundamentally evil, what did that make them? Were they monsters too? They scrubbed floors, peeled potatoes, and mended clothes, their hands busy but their minds racing, re-examining every memory, every order they had followed, every piece of propaganda they had believed. They had been told they were defending German culture from the hordes of the East and the decadence of the West. But what culture produced ovens for human beings? What civilization built factories for death? The unexpected kindness of their captors was now cast in a new, horrifying light. It was no longer a sign of weakness or a clever tactic, it was a moral judgment. The Americans' behavior, their lack of cruelty, their adherence to rules, their simple, mundane decency was a constant, silent reproach. It demonstrated that it was possible to wage war without losing one's humanity. It was a standard against which their own nation's actions were measured and found monstrously wanting. A guard sharing his chewing gum with a child in the nearby village, a medic carefully bandaging the hand of a prisoner who had cut herself in the kitchen. These small acts became unbearably profound. They were not extraordinary, they were ordinary, and that was the point. Their captors' humanity was their default setting. It was not a mask they put on, it was who they were. The women began to watch them with a new, painful curiosity. They observed the easy friendships among the GIs, the way they joked and complained about their commanding officers, the pictures of their wives and sweethearts they carried. They were not the ideological fanatics the women had been. They were citizens, temporarily in uniform, doing a job they wanted to see finished so they could go home. They were fighting for a world where they could play baseball and go to the movies and raise their families in peace. This realization was the core of their psychological collapse. Their worldview was built on the premise of their own moral and racial superiority. They were the architects of a new, heroic age. All their sacrifices were justified by the glorious future they were building. Now, they were forced to confront the possibility that the people they had dismissed as inferior, as soulless materialists, actually possessed a stronger, more resilient moral core than they did. The American strength was not just in their endless supply of tanks, planes, and white bread. It was in the very fabric of their society, a society that, for all its flaws, did not require the demonization of an entire race or the industrial-scale murder of civilians to sustain itself. The women felt a profound sense of shame, a humiliation that went far deeper than military defeat. It was a spiritual and ideological annihilation. They had been proud members of the Hitler Youth. They had sworn oaths of loyalty. They had worked tirelessly for the war effort, believing they were on the side of righteousness. Now they saw themselves as deluded followers of a criminal gang, the dupes of a monstrous lie. The truth of the concentration camps stole their past, while the humanity of their captors stole their future, for it showed them a world whose values they could never have hoped to defeat. The enemy was not the men with the guns guarding the wire fence. The enemy was the lie that had been living inside their own heads for 12 years. We're about to reach the climax of this transformative journey. If you've made it this far, you're one of the truly curious. Let us know you're here by typing "truth" in the comments. The culmination of this slow, agonizing transformation was not a single dramatic event, but a quiet, almost imperceptible shift in perspective.
It happened one afternoon in the early autumn. A new shipment of supplies had arrived, and with it a projector and a new set of films. Not propaganda this time, but Hollywood movies. Simple entertainment, meant to pass the long hours for the guards, which the camp commandant had, in a gesture of paternalistic authority, decided the prisoners could also watch. The first film was a musical, a riot of impossible color and sound, featuring impossibly beautiful people in impossibly clean clothes, singing and dancing for reasons that were entirely frivolous. It was a vision of a world so completely removed from their reality of war, rubble, and rationing that it felt like a transmission from another planet. Initially, the women watched with a cynical detachment. This was the decadence they had been warned about, the superficial, empty culture they were supposed to despise. It was ridiculous. It was meaningless. The camera pans across the faces of the women. At first, they are stern, judgmental. Then, slowly, you see the hardness begin to melt. As the film progressed, something began to change. They saw the sheer, unadulterated energy and optimism of it all. The easy confidence of the actors, the incredible expense of the sets, the casual abundance on display in every frame, a cornucopia of food, fashion, and chrome-plated automobiles. They had been told this was a sign of weakness, of a society rotting from within, but now they saw it for what it truly was, a symbol of breathtaking, unassailable power, a nation that could produce this level of sheer, glorious nonsense while simultaneously fighting a global war on two fronts was not weak, it was a leviathan. It possessed a surplus of wealth, creativity, and energy so vast that it could afford to waste it on musicals. The realization dawned on them with the force of a physical blow. Their own country had poured every last resource, every ounce of will, every pfennig into its war machine. German cinema had become a grim, gray procession of heroic sacrifice and hateful propaganda. The Reich had no energy left for frivolity. It had no room for dancing, for laughter, for pointless beauty. It had sacrificed all of its joy at the altar of total war, and it had still lost. The film ended. The lights came on, but the women did not move. They sat staring at the blank white screen, the ghost of the final triumphant musical number still dancing in their heads. In that moment, the kindness of the guards, the penicillin, the white bread, and the Technicolor musical all merged into a single overwhelming concept. They were not separate, unrelated phenomena. They were all expressions of the same fundamental truth. They were the symptoms of a society so powerful, so wealthy, and so confident in its own foundational values that it could afford to be generous. It could afford to be humane to its prisoners. It could afford to create art that was utterly useless and beautiful. Their own ideology, built on a foundation of resentment, scarcity, and hate, had been a brittle, fragile thing. It had demanded everything from its people and had given them nothing but death and ruin in return. It had to be propped up by constant lies, enforced by terror, and fueled by a manufactured sense of superiority. The American way of life, which they had been taught to see as their antithesis, was, in fact, their undoing. It had not defeated them with bombs and bullets alone, but with an idea of life that was simply better, more resilient, more human. It was in that moment of collective, silent understanding that the war truly ended for them. The battle was lost not on the fields of Normandy or the streets of Berlin, but here, in a dusty barn in Bavaria, in the face of a Hollywood musical. The most potent weapon they faced was not a bomb, but a culture of abundance and the simple revolutionary idea that life could be more than just a struggle for survival. This channel is dedicated to understanding the psychological impact of history. By subscribing and turning on notifications, you join a community that seeks to understand the past on a deeper level. The journey home, months later, was a journey into a strange land. They were repatriated to a Germany that was physically and spiritually unrecognizable. The cities were skeletal remains, mountains of rubble where life had once thrived. The people were gaunt, gray-faced survivors, their eyes holding a familiar mixture of exhaustion and denial. The women returned to their families, or what was left of them, carrying a terrible, secret knowledge. They had seen two things that the rest of their countrymen had not: the depths of their own nation's depravity and the unexpected face of their enemy's strength. They tried at first to talk about it. They tried to explain the systematic kindness of the American camp, the shock of the newsreels, the slow, painful unraveling of their faith. But their words fell on deaf ears. No one wanted to hear it. Those who had remained in Germany had their own horrors to deal with: the Soviet occupation in the East, the hunger, the shame of defeat. To them, the stories of well-fed prisoners and humane guards sounded like a betrayal, or worse, a fantasy. "You were lucky," their mothers and sisters would say, their voices sharp with resentment. "You don't know what it was like here." So they fell silent. The experience became a private burden, a memory they could only share with each other, the other women from the camp who had seen what they had seen. It isolated them. They were no longer the proud, defiant women of the Reich, nor could they fully embrace the new, post-war Germany that was being built on the ashes of their former beliefs. They were caught in between, ghosts of a dead ideology, haunted by a truth they could not articulate. Anke, the nurse who had been saved by penicillin, dedicated her life to working with international relief agencies, a quiet, lifelong penance for the horrors committed in her nation's name. Ilsa, the stubborn denier, eventually broke, suffering a nervous collapse from which she never fully recovered. Greta, the youngest, married a quiet man, raised a family, and never once spoke of the war, her silence a wall she built around a memory too painful to touch. The experience did not cure them of their past, but it permanently altered their perception of the world. It replaced the simple, brutal certainty of their youth with a complicated and often painful understanding of human nature. They had learned that evil was not always monstrous and loud. It could be bureaucratic and banal. And they had learned that strength was not always found in hardness and cruelty. It could be found in generosity, in restraint, and in the ability to play a game of baseball in the midst of a war. This was the long-term legacy of their captivity. It was not a story of conversion, but of disillusionment. The moral and ideological shock they experienced was a crucible that burned away the lies they had been told, leaving behind the hard, unvarnished truth. They had gone into that camp as soldiers of the Third Reich, believers in a cause they thought was just. They emerged as something else entirely: witnesses. Witnesses to the collapse of their world, not just under the weight of bombs, but under the weight of a simple loaf of white bread, a dose of penicillin, and the flickering colored lights of a Hollywood film. They were a living testament to the fact that their ideology had failed, not only on the battlefield, but in the most fundamental contest of all, the one between a system built on lies and a reality it could no longer deny.
The war had ended, but for these women, the internal struggle, the quiet reckoning with what they had been and what they had seen, would last a lifetime. Their war was over, but the aftershocks of their awakening would echo for the rest of their days, a permanent reminder of the fragility of belief and the enduring power of a devastating truth. History is filled with these profound moments of personal and collective change. To continue exploring these stories with us, please make sure you are subscribed and have shared this documentary with others who appreciate a deeper look into our past.